It's been great being here for the last week at GV. One of the things I've enjoyed most about teaching is, first, I've never been to South America, I've never been to Brazil, so just the opportunity to be at a Brazilian law school, especially one of a quality such as GV, has been great for me in terms of my personal growth and development as a teacher and as a lawyer. It's been interesting to visit Sao Paulo. But what I've really enjoyed is the students. The students have been bright, they've been engaged and interested. I think they're excited about the topic that I've been teaching, which is human rights and corporations. And I really like the international flavor of the class. This particular class has students from Europe, have a student from New Zealand, a student from China, an American student, several Brazilian students, and students from elsewhere in Latin America. So for me as a North American professor who works primarily with American students, having an opportunity to teach in a more international environment outside of North America has been particularly interesting and I think fruitful because it offers the classroom an opportunity to, combine different experiences and cultures and points of view, which I think creates a better educational environment. Well, globalization has, of course, created opportunities for businesses, especially large multinational corporations, to move around the world and find places to invest that are not always capable of having the ability to regulate corporate activities and corporate operations. So what we have is an understanding now that these large corporations themselves are almost as powerful as states, or they have the capacity in the same way that states do to impact human rights, to impact local economies, to impact local environments in ways that need to be controlled and regulated so that human rights are recognized and protected in the context of those foreign business activities. So you have this interesting question that really people who are interested in international human rights law have started to struggle with in the last 20 or 30 years, which is what is the best way to control corporate and multinational activity that is detrimental to the host country, the place that the investment activity is taking place in. The problem with the international human rights law regime is that traditionally human rights law developed collectively with the community of nations entering into treaties, and those treaties create binding obligations on states, and only states. There's not binding obligations with respect to individuals, citizens, or with respect to business entities. The international human rights law is applicable to and binding on states. Now there is international human rights law having to do with gross human rights violations of a criminal nature that apply to individuals, but in general the human rights law operates at the level of states and the relationship between states. So now that we have globalized major business activity by multinational corporations, and those corporations are operating in countries that are sometimes economically and politically weak, that is to say poor countries, third world countries, it's possible for these corporations to impact those countries without anyone really monitoring or being in a position to enforce human rights standards and norms. You have to ask yourself, if the home country of a corporation, let's say it's an American corporation or a Brazilian corporation, has regulations that deal with human rights, labor issues, environmental issues, mostly those regulations and those laws are going to deal with the operations of businesses in the home country's territory, and the home country may not be particularly interested in what a corporation does when it invests and conducts business activities abroad. You also have the possibility that the host country, the place where the business activity is being conducted, does not have a political framework or the economic power to control and regulate corporate activities, especially those activities that might not be beneficial to the human rights of the local population. You have a situation too where, perhaps the poor country where the investment activity is taking place does not have the political will or the desire to control corporate activity, because the main goal is to simply incentivize and encourage foreign investment in that country for purposes of economic development. You have problems sometimes of regimes being corrupt, regimes being politically unstable. You have some regimes that are in conflict. And again, you have then the situation where a corporation is in a position, if it wants to be, to treat people in a way and treat the local environment in a way that it would not be permitted to do if it was back home doing business in its home country. So the tension here is between, on the one hand, wanting to encourage foreign investment and international business enterprise, but at the same time wanting to make sure that those investment activities recognize and protect and prevent human rights violations. What is the best way to do this? And that's the question that's facing the international community right now. Many non-governmental organizations and human rights advocates believe that it's time now for nations to come together and to enter into treaties that create direct obligations that are enforceable against corporations themselves, not just against states. Many in the business community have resisted that. The United Nations has not yet been successful in developing a model that has achieved any kind of consensus whereby international human rights norms are applicable to and binding against corporations themselves. So as an alternative to that, in more recent years, the United Nations, through the Human Rights Council, has mandated to a fellow named John Ruggie, who's a well-known and respected international human rights expert. He's both a teacher and someone who's worked in the United Nations organization for many, many years. They've mandated that he come up with a proposal that might be acceptable both to the business community and the other constituents, including the non-governmental organizations and countries, both small and large. And the outcome of that mandate and the process of his investigation and his research and his thinking on this was something called the general or the guiding principles on business and human rights. And it basically talks about obligations that states have to ensure that actors within their state jurisdiction operate in such a way as to respect and prevent human rights. But what's really important is this idea that corporations themselves, businesses, have obligations to voluntarily undertake to proactively and intentionally create business cultures that protect human rights and prevent human rights abuses, and when abuses do happen, to engage in some kind of remediation that allows victims to be compensated and to be otherwise relieved of the injuries or the consequences of the injuries that they may have suffered as a result of corporate activity. And so these general principles over time are thought to be the kinds of principles that will be uniformly applied throughout the world to all businesses, large, medium, and small, in such a way that there will be an understanding in the business world that the business world has obligations that it has to undertake. And if they don't undertake those obligations, while they may not be violating any legal rights, They will be violating these norms that will cause them presumably to have trouble in terms of public relations, consumer resistance to their products and their services, and otherwise become outliers in the business community so that they're not as successful achieving their economic goals as they would like to be. This is controversial because many organizations and human rights advocates continue to feel that the only meaningful way, realistic way, to get the attention of the international business actors is through creating legal rights that have legal consequences. Others say it's unrealistic to expect that the community of nations will ever be able or willing to do that, so that the only practical and pragmatic approach is the approach that John Ruggie utilized in coming up with his guiding principles on business and human rights. So it remains to be seen whether these guiding principles have the moral force and the practical wherewithal to create new cultures and new ways of thinking within corporations so that they're more conscious and more intentional about making sure that human rights are taken seriously, and that they develop structures and frameworks within each business organization to ensure that all of the actors within that organization are participating in a proactive and meaningful way to accomplish the goals that are set forth in the principles. And we'll see. There continues to be, as I said earlier, controversy and debate about whether or not the effort to regulate corporate behavior should be voluntary and taken on by businesses themselves, or whether or not it should be imposed on businesses through a international human rights regime that is a product of treaties and declarations and decisions that are made among the states. I'm not sure myself exactly what the most practical way of approaching this problem might be. I happen to think that John Ruggie's approach by creating these guiding principles is one that we have to live with right now. And because things in the international sphere take so much time to evolve, it may simply be that we are, faced with another generation of work and advocacy and education in applying these guiding principles, so that 20 years from now, the kinds of problems that we see in globalization today do not occur, or do not occur at such a level of magnitude or frequency. It would be desirable in a theoretical way to have treaties that create enforceable obligations directly against corporations and foreign investment activity. I personally don't think that that's going to happen, and so we're probably left with this idea of a developing consensus around the adoption of these so-called guiding principles. I understand the question to be that there are big differences between nations in terms of their legal frameworks and the legal systems that they have with regard to how they deal with human rights enforcement or violations, and how they deal with regulating the behavior of corporations. The reason that we have international law is because you can't count on individual states to always have the same legal frameworks, the same protections, and the same remedies available. And therefore, if you create a system of international law norms that apply regardless of where you are or what country you're operating in, then you overcome this problem of differences between states and their approaches to problem solving, especially with respect to human rights. So, theoretically, the idea is whether a business is operating in Bangladesh or operating in a Latin American country or an African country, or in a developed northern country, say a European country, that those businesses recognize that their obligations are the same. And then you have the question of, well, how are those obligations going to be enforced? And importantly, if they're enforced too stringently, if the consequence to a business investor is such that the business investor believes it's too costly or too undesirable to comply with the norms that might be expected in a particular country, can the business just close its shop, close down, move to another country where maybe it's easier or less costly to conduct the business, thereby creating more profits and perhaps more satisfaction for the owners or the shareholders? Well, you know, the idea ultimately is businesses should not be in a position where they can pick and choose different countries to operate in on the theory that those countries will not require compliance with basic human rights norms. And the idea is that at some point the businesses will understand and embrace voluntarily these norms regardless of where they're operating, simply because the international community expects it, even though the individual state might not. Well, there's lots of areas. We could talk about individual cases, but it might be better and more understandable to talk in terms of sectors of the economy or kinds of businesses. We have mining that has created problems throughout the world in terms of affecting and impacting local environments, as well as the effect on local economies, the effect on local populations in terms of people being forcibly moved from their villages, from their communities, people not being able to participate in the decision making that affects their lives. Sometimes you have political repression where companies work with local governments to prevent people from speaking out or resisting the investment activity, the business activity. This was particularly true in large mining operations. It's certainly true in the business of producing oil and transporting oil. You've got oil companies in Africa, oil companies in Burma, oil companies in other parts of the world that have gone in, extracted oil, made lots and lots of money, but have not necessarily left the wealth in the country or conducted themselves in a way that have produced benefits for the local population. They've also been involved in sometimes polluting the earth, polluting the water, and polluting the atmosphere, both locally and in a larger global sense. You have problems in the textile industry, in the industry of making clothes, where Western companies, large companies, will pick countries to operate in, like Bangladesh, like Korea, like China these days, like Indonesia, like Vietnam, where they can create conditions of employment that are violative of human rights and not at all consistent with the kinds of expectations that those companies would have if they were doing business back home, whether home happens to be Europe or North America or Brazil. So you've got the problem of sweatshops. You have the problem of forced labor, of basically turning people into slaves. You have the problem of making people work too hard and not giving them adequate compensation. You have the problem of working conditions, which contribute to people getting sick and people suffering needlessly because the protections aren't there through their employment. You have the problem of child labor. So you've got different kinds of problems depending on the business that's involved, and some of those businesses can be changed as a result of boycotts and consumer resistance and education and advocacy on the part of human rights organizations. Other kinds of activities are a little harder to get at, including oil and mining, because sometimes the products that come out of that are not necessarily identified as the particular problem. As say if Nike produces a tennis shoe and all of a sudden people find out that tennis shoe came out of a sweatshop in Vietnam, hypothetically, people can say, I'm not going to buy Nike products. But if an oil company produces environmental damage, say in an African country like Nigeria, people aren't generally going to say, I'm not going to buy gas anymore. So you've got problems relating to the way in which consumers and consumer organization and human rights advocacy organizations can respond or do respond to particular violations.